The Alien Medical Academy was buzzing with a strange kind of excitement that morning, and even the most calm and quiet students felt their hearts beating a little faster as they moved through the tall silver halls made of shining metal walls that reflected their every movement, and the bright glow of the ceiling lights gave the place a clean and almost sterile feeling, yet the air was filled with whispers and rumors about the new exchange student who was coming from a faraway place most had only read about in the archives of dangerous planets. Today was not a normal day, because the entire class would meet someone they had only heard about through stories and warnings from their parents and teachers and commanders, and all those warnings spoke of a strange species called humans and of a world so deadly it was called a Deathworld, a place where storms could tear down mountains, where beasts with teeth as long as an arm could attack, without warning, and where even the smallest insect could kill with a single sting. The alien students had heard strange and often frightening things about these Deathworlders and their survival skills, and most did not believe half the things they heard, but some wondered if any of it could be true, and in their minds they imagined a giant with scars across his body and eyes as cold as space itself, while others thought maybe humans were just another type of mammal with clever tricks and strong muscles, but not so different from anyone else. When the door to the training hall opened, all those whispers stopped as if someone had taken the sound out of the air, and every head turned to look at the figure who stepped inside the room was suddenly silent, and the air felt tense, as if a storm had rolled in from nowhere. The human steps were slow and steady, and his eyes scanned a room, like a soldier on a battlefield marking exits, corners, and positions of every student, as if preparing for a fight. His clothes were simple, but worn in a way that spoke of long travel and hard use, and across his arms were faint marks that looked like old wounds. No one moved, and no one spoke until the instructor, a tall alien with pale green skin and long silver horns rising from his head, broke the silence with a voice that echoed against the walls. Today, he said, we will witness a live first aid demonstration from our new exchange student from Earth. He called it by his name, but to most of the students the name was already forgotten, because what mattered was the word Earth and the heavy thought of Deathworlder medicine. The alien students expected something clean, gentle, and perfectly medical, like the kind of work they had trained for since their first year. They imagined neat rows of sterile tools placed on a shining table, and careful movements guided by scanners and nanobots, and quiet words of reassurance to the patient. They imagined a safe learning experience and nothing more. But when a human stepped forward, he did not walk to the prepared table with its neat instruments. Instead, he reached into the old rough-looking bag slung across his shoulder and pulled out tools that looked nothing like the soft, curved designs of alien medical gear. They were made of metal and leather, and wires. Some were sharp, some were heavy, and all of them looked like they belonged in a war zone rather than a peaceful academy. One was a long needle with a thick handle, another was a strange folding blade, and there was a device that looked like it could burn right through flesh if used the wrong way. The aliens stared, some with confusion and some with a hint of fear in their eyes. A few exchanged glances, as if silently asking each other if this was some kind of test or joke. But the human simply began checking each tool, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His hands moved with speed and certainty, and every movement was quick and economical, with no wasted motion. His face gave nothing away, and the only sound was the quiet clink of metal as he set each piece down on a small portable tray he had brought with him. The instructor hesitated for a moment, as if wondering whether to interrupt, but then decided to continue, perhaps thinking that this was simply the human way of preparing for a demonstration, and that the alien students would learn something new today, and maybe they would be shocked, but still they would gain knowledge and understanding of Deathworlder methods. The human looked up at the class, his gaze sharp and his voice calm. When he spoke, he said that on his world, first aid was not always about being gentle or clean, that sometimes the goal was simply to keep someone alive for another minute, another hour, another day, until real help could arrive. And in those moments, you could not wait for the perfect tool or the safest method. You had to use what you had, and you had to act fast. The alien students listened, but many of them still felt unsure about what they were seeing and hearing. Some thought maybe humans simply enjoyed using dangerous-looking tools, and that this was all for show. Others began to feel an uneasy curiosity about what kind of situations would require such methods, and whether these Deathworlders really faced danger. so often that they had turned medicine into a kind of battle skill. The human picked up one of the sharper tools and spun it lightly in his fingers, then placed it carefully beside the others. His eyes kept flicking toward the door as if he were expecting something to happen, and the students began to notice that strange focus in his gaze, like he was ready for an emergency, even though this was supposed to be a planned and controlled demonstration. The instructor started to explain the procedure they would watch, but before he could finish, a sudden loud alarm echoed through the entire hall, and the walls flashed with a deep red light. Every student turned toward the source of the noise, and the instructor's expression changed instantly from calm to alarmed. A voice came over the intercom announcing that an emergency patient was being rushed into the training hall from the nearby field station. The words came: fast and urgent, massive trauma. Severe bleeding, immediate attention required. The alien students froze, unsure of what to do, as the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall slid open and several medics pushed in a floating stretcher on which lay a figure covered in dark green blood that dripped steadily onto the floor, leaving a trail behind. The medics shouted for help, but their voices were shaky and uncertain, as if they were already sure that the patient's life was slipping away faster than they could stop it. The human had already moved before anyone else could react. His bag was open in one hand, and the other was already reaching for the strange warlike tools he had set down only moments before. His movements were quick and precise, his eyes locked on the wounded figure, and the alien students realized with a mix of dread and fascination that they were about to see Deathworlder medicine, not in a calm lesson, but in a real fight against death itself. And in that moment, they understood why the human had looked at them earlier with the eyes of a soldier, because on his world, every moment could be the moment between life and death. And now that moment had come right here in their academy, and none of them were ready for what they were about to witness. The injured alien was placed on the table in the center of the training hall, and the smell of blood was sharp in the air, mixing with the faint chemical scent of cleaning agents. And for the first time, many of the alien students realized how unprepared they were for something like this. The wounded alien's body shook slightly with each shallow breath, and the wound across his chest was deep enough to show muscle and strange green tissue that pulsed weakly. The alien medics who had brought him in looked pale and unsteady. Their voices were low as they explained that the patient had been in an explosion at the nearby maintenance site and had lost a dangerous amount of blood on the way here. And one of them added that their usual healing gel had failed to stop the bleeding completely and that the situation was critical. Many students instinctively stepped back from the table, not wanting to be too close to the site of so much injury, and the flow of green blood was steady, making soft, wet sounds as it dripped onto the floor. The color glowed faintly under the training hall lights, and the sight was almost hypnotic in a terrible way. The human, however, did not step back. Instead, he leaned forward with sharp focus, and his eyes moved across the injury, like he was mapping every detail in his head. His hand reached for a small metal case from his bag, and in one motion, he flipped it open to reveal a set of compact tools wrapped in cloth. They were not elegant or shiny like alien medical devices, but they were clean and arranged with careful precision. Without asking for permission, he took out a strange metal stick with a flat, rounded end and pulled a small fuel canister from his bag. He attached the two pieces with quick, sure movements, and then twisted a small valve. With a click, a blue flame roared to life at the tip of the stick. The sudden heat shimmer made several students flinch back. "What is he doing?" one of the alien students whispered, their voice trembling, and another answered in a hushed tone, "I think he's going to burn the wound." But why would anyone do that? The human glanced up for a second and said in a low voice, not meant for comfort, "If we cannot stop the bleeding, the patient will die right now. This will close the vessel walls and give me time to stabilize him." Before anyone could protest, he pressed the glowing hot tip directly to the open wound. The patient let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a gasp, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air like bitter smoke. Several students turned away, clutching their stomachs, unable to watch, but the human's face did not change. His eyes stayed locked on his work, and his free hand held the patient steady as he moved the heated tip in short, precise touches, sealing the torn edges of flesh. The sound was faint but constant, like a soft hiss each time the hot metal met living tissue. And though it was brutal, it was effective. The bleeding slowed and then stopped entirely. The once open wound, now closed with dark seared lines. The human switched off the flame and set the tool aside, without looking up his hand, already reaching for another item in his kit, a thick curved needle with black thread. He threaded the needle quickly and began stitching over the sealed wound, his hands moving so fast the needle was almost a blur. The alien students watched with wide eyes, some realizing for the first time that there was no hesitation in any of his actions. Every choice seemed final and absolute, as if he had no time to doubt himself or wait for someone else to guide him. As the final stitch went in, the patient's body gave a sudden jerk, and the heart monitor beside the table let out a long, continuous tone. The sound was flat and cold, and it cut through the room like a blade. Every alien froze. The meaning was clear. The patient's heart had stopped. The human reacted instantly, climbing halfway onto the table and placing both hands on the alien's chest, then pressing down hard in a steady rhythm. His voice came out firm and commanding, counting softly under his breath, 1, 2, 3, for then a deep breath into the patient's mouth, then back to the pressing motion. The alien students whispered among themselves, some in disbelief and others in fear. Why is he hitting the patient like that? Is this an attack or a treatment? The instructor, who had been silent until now, spoke with a strange calmness, explaining that this was a method called chest compressions, and that it was an ancient form of first aid used by Deathworlders to restart the heart in an emergency. The human continued his relentless rhythm, sweat starting to run down the side of his face, his muscles tensing with each push, and his jaw locked tight, as if he were wrestling against something invisible. The room was so quiet that the only sounds were the rhythmic pressure of his hands, the faint squeak of the table, and the long tone of the heart monitor. After several long moments, the flat tone was broken by a sharp, irregular beat. The patient's chest rose suddenly with a ragged breath. The beeping steadied into a weak but steady rhythm, and the alien students let out a collective exhale. The human leaned back for a moment, breathing heavily, then checking the patient's pulse with quick fingers. The relief in the room was short-lived because the emergency doors burst open again, and a second stretcher was rushed in, this one carrying another alien, who looked even worse than the first. The body was covered in deep burns and torn skin, and the breathing was faint and uneven. The medic shouted that this one had been closest to the explosion and had only barely been pulled out alive. The human's eyes narrowed as he stepped toward the second patient. Without a single word, his bag was in his hand again, and the alien students felt their stomachs tighten. They had just seen one life pulled back from the edge with strange, brutal methods, and now they were about to see it all over again. But the injuries here looked beyond repair, and even the instructor's face held doubt. The second alien's chest barely moved with each breath, and the skin was cracked and blackened in wide patches. The human began pulling more tools from his bag, including a pair of heavy shears that he used to cut away the burned clothing pieces falling to the floor in smoking scraps. He asked for strong painkillers, and when the alien medic said they had nothing strong enough, he muttered that there was no time for comfort, only survival. The alien students stood frozen, some with their hands over their mouths, others gripping the sides of the benches they stood behind, as the human took out a curved needle and thread again and began closing torn flesh with speed, each stitch pulling the skin together despite the faint groans of the patient, who was too weak to even scream properly. Each pull of the thread was quick and firm, and the blood loss slowed with every pass of the needle. The patient's breathing was still weak and shallow, the chest rising less and less with each moment. The human's hands did not slow, but there was something in his eyes now, a sharp urgency, as if he could feel time slipping away. The beeping of the portable monitor beside the stretcher began to slow, and the sound made every student's pulse quicken in fear. The human pulled the final stitch closed and tied it with a fast knot, then reached for another tool. But before he could use it, the monitor gave a long, steady tone. The patient's chest stopped moving entirely. The breathing was gone, and the stillness was heavy like a shadow falling over the whole room. The human dropped the tool back into his bag and leaned over the patient, placing his hands on the chest with the same fierce determination they had seen before, and he began to press hard in a steady rhythm, his voice low and urgent, as if speaking to someone far away, telling them not to stop, not to give, and not to die here. And now the alien students could not look away, because they knew this was not just a lesson anymore, it was a real fight, and they were watching the human battle death itself right there in front of them. Cliffhanger. The patient's body gave no sign of life, and the human's voice rose in a harsh command as he slammed his fist into the alien's chest, shouting, "Do not you dare die on me." The human's hands moved like they were powered by something deeper than strength, something raw and unyielding. Each push into the alien's chest was forceful enough to make the ribs bend, and the sound echoed through the training hall with a steady beat that was both frightening and hypnotic. The alien students stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the scene, their hearts pounding as if they too were being pressed by those relentless hands. The monitor beside the stretcher still let out the long, flat tone that meant no life remained, and the alien patient lay motionless with the pale green of his skin looking even duller under the harsh lights. The human's voice was low but filled with a strange mix of anger and desperation as he spoke between compressions, telling the alien to keep fighting, to stay here, to not give death the satisfaction of winning this round. His words were like an unshakable command, not a plea. Sweat dripped down his temples, and the muscles in his arms strained with every push. The human's breathing grew heavier, but he did not slow, not even when the patient's body remained still. He leaned down and forced a breath into the alien's lungs, sealing his mouth over the other's strange anatomy in a practiced movement, before returning immediately to the chest compressions. The rhythm was unbroken and fierce. To the alien students, this did not look like medicine. It looked like violence, pure and simple. Their own medical methods were soft, calculated, precise, and slow compared to this raw and forceful attack on the still body before them. Yet there was no mistaking the way the humans' every action was aimed at one thing: to bring the patient back from the silent void that had claimed him. One student whispered that this could break the alien's ribs, another said maybe that was the point, and a third shook their head, unable to understand why a Deathworlder would risk further injury like this. The instructor stood with a strange stillness, his gaze locked on the human, as if weighing every move, every breath, every choice that was being made in those tense moments. Then, without warning, the long tone of the monitor broke into a stuttering, uneven series of beeps. The alien's chest twitched, then rose with a ragged breath that sounded like it was being dragged up from the depths of some dark ocean. A murmur went through the students, as if they could not believe what they had just seen. The beeping steadied into a weak but unmistakable rhythm. The patient was alive. The human sat back for only a moment, his hand still resting on the patient's chest, to feel the faint beat of the heart. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, then looked toward the alien medics and gave a short command to prepare for fluid replacement and oxygen. The medics scrambled into motion, their earlier hesitation replaced by the urgency in the human's tone. But the moment of relief was short-lived, because another sound cut through the hall, the sharp crack of an explosion somewhere nearby. It was distant, but strong enough to make the floor tremble slightly. Dust falling from the high beams of the ceiling. A voice came through the intercom, announcing that a secondary blast had occurred at the same site, and more casualties were being brought in. The alien students looked at one another, their faces pale, with the sudden realization that this was not a single isolated event. There would be more wounded, more blood, more moments where life and death were decided in seconds, and they were about to watch the human repeat his terrifying methods again and again. The first of the new casualties arrived only moments later, carried on a stretcher by two medics who looked almost as shaken as their patient. This alien had burns across most of his body, deep blackened patches where the skin had cracked, and blistered smoke still rising faintly from the wounds. The smell was thick and sharp, filling the room with a stench that made several students cover their mouths. The breathing was shallow, the eyes barely open. The human moved quickly, his hands already pulling more tools from his bag, this time a roll of coarse bandage, a pair of heavy scissors, and a small pouch filled with powder that none of the aliens recognized. Without hesitation, he cut away the patient's clothing, revealing the full extent of the damage. He spoke sharply to the medics, asking for cool fluid, and when they hesitated, he repeated the order in a tone that made it impossible to ignore. He sprinkled the powder directly onto the burns, and the alien patient flinched weakly. The powder hissed faintly as it touched the scorched flesh, and the smell changed, becoming something less harsh, but still strange to the alien noses. The human explained in a clipped voice that it would keep infection from setting in, and buy time until more advanced treatment was possible. His movements were fast and sure, his hands never pausing, even as his eyes scanned the rest of the patient's injuries. A deep cut along the side of the alien's torso was bleeding heavily, and without waiting for anyone else to act, the human pressed his hand over hard. The patient groaned, but the bleeding slowed. He pulled out a thick curved needle again, threading it with black cord, and began stitching the wound in swift, precise loops, the thread pulled tight with each pass, closing the gap in the torn flesh. One student whispered that they would have used a healing gel for such an injury. Another said that the gel would not work on burns this severe. The human either heard them or guessed their thoughts, because he spoke without looking up, saying that on his world there was no perfect tool for every wound, only the skill and will to make do with what you had in the moment. His words carried no pride, only a hard kind of truth that settled over the room like a weight. As the last stitch was tied, the patient's breathing faltered, the chest rising less with each breath. The beeping of the monitor slowed, and the human's eyes snapped to the screen, his hand moving instantly to check the pulse. It was fading fast, too fast. Without hesitation, he set the needle aside and placed both hands on the alien's chest, beginning compressions once more, the rhythm hard and unyielding, the patient's body jolting slightly with each push. The alien students were no longer whispering. They stood frozen, watching every movement, their minds torn between horror at the brutality and awe at the determination. They were seeing the human's voice was low again, speaking to the patient, telling him to breathe, to fight, to come back. The words carried the weight of someone who had done this too many times before and had lost too many to stop now. The beeping on the monitor became irregular, jagged in its pattern. The breaths grew even weaker. The human leaned down, forcing another breath into the patient's mouth, then returning to the pressing motion. Without losing the beat, his face was tense, his eyes locked on the patient, as if willing them to return to life. For long seconds, nothing changed, and the stillness in the room grew heavier with each moment. It felt like the very air was waiting, holding its breath alongside the alien students. The human pressed harder, his arms straining, his voice rising in urgency and command, as if sheer will could force the heart to beat again. Then the monitor gave a sharp double beep, followed by another. The chest rose faintly, and the alien let out a soft, choking gasp. The human did not stop the compressions immediately, but eased them gradually, checking the pulse with one hand. When he found it faint but present, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering only slightly. The alien students released the breaths they had been holding, some leaning back against the walls, as if the tension had drained their strength. The human began giving instructions to stabilize the patient, his tone firm but calmer than before. The medics obeyed, quickly moving the patient to a side station for continued care. But before the human could even wipe the sweat from his brow, the intercom sounded again. This time the voice was tense and clipped. There is another patient on the way, critical condition, possible multiple organ failure. Prepare immediately. The training hall fell silent again, and every pair of eyes turned to the human. Cliffhanger. The doors slammed open, and the sight that entered made even the human pause for the first time that day. The doors burst open, and a team of medics rushed in, carrying a stretcher that looked far too small for the alien. Lying on it, the figure was tall and broad, but his body was limp and twisted in a way that made every onlooker feel a cold shiver. The skin was pale, with an unhealthy gray tone, and the breathing was so shallow it could barely be seen. His chest rose once, then paused for what felt like far too long before rising again. There were deep, jagged wounds running along his side and across his lower abdomen, torn flesh revealing pale muscle and strange organ structures glistening in the harsh light. The alien students gasped, some taking a step back, and even the instructor's eyes narrowed with the weight of grim understanding. This patient was beyond what their academy had trained them for. One of the medics said quickly that the victim had been trapped under a fallen metal beam during the explosion and had suffered massive internal damage, as well as heavy blood loss. Another medic shook their head, adding that their scanner suggested multiple organs were failing and that the patient might not survive the trip to the main hospital. The human was already moving toward the stretcher before the medic could finish speaking. His bag was open, and his hands pulled out a pair of heavy shears and a sealed roll of cloth bandage. He cut away the clothing and armor with sharp, clean snips, the sound of metal snapping under the blades ringing out in the tense room. The sight beneath made several students look away. Burns and deep cuts ran together in a map of destruction, and blood pooled in the creases of the stretcher. Without pausing, the human called out for the strongest painkiller. They had his voice carrying authority that allowed no hesitation, but when the alien medics exchanged nervous looks and said that nothing in their supply could match what was needed for an injury of this scale, the human's jaw tightened, and he muttered then, "They will have to endure it." His hands did not slow as he began working the bandage across the worst of the bleeding points, pressing down with force until the green blood seeped through, then wrapping it tighter until the flow slowed. He pulled out a curved needle and thick thread, the kind meant for heavy stitching, and began closing the gashes across the abdomen. Each stitch pulled the skin together, but there was no time for neatness. Every second mattered more than appearance. The patient groaned weakly, the sound little more than air escaping, and the human leaned in close, saying in a low voice, "Stay with me, stay here." The alien students could not look away, even if they wanted, to the speed of the human's movements, the intensity in his eyes, the way every action seemed to drag the patient back from the edge of something unseen. It was both horrifying and mesmerizing. One student whispered that no alien medic would risk stitching without stabilizing the organs first. Another replied that maybe Deathworlders had different priorities, that maybe keeping blood inside the body was more urgent than anything else. The human reached for another tool, a small metal clamp with curved jaws, and slid it deep into one of the wounds, closing it with a quick squeeze to stop a hidden vessel from bleeding. The patient shuddered violently at the pressure, but the human's hand held steady. He reached for another clamp and repeated the action in a second wound. The monitor beside the stretcher began to slow, its beeping, the heart rate dropping beat by beat. The human's head snapped toward it, his eyes narrowing, and he pressed one hand over the stitched abdomen, the other going to the patient's neck to feel the pulse. It was weak too, weak. His voice cut through the room like a blade, clear and sharp. "He is going into cardiac arrest." Without warning, he climbed halfway onto the stretcher, his knees bracing against the edge, and he began pressing hard into the patient's chest, the sound of each compression filling the hall. The alien students flinched with every push, the patient's body jerking under the force. The human counted under his breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, then leaned down to force air into the alien's lungs before resuming the rhythm again and again. Some students looked horrified, others looked as if they were watching a battle they had never seen before. The instructor stood with arms crossed, his gaze unblinking, as if trying to memorize every movement for future study. The human kept going, sweat starting to drip onto the patient's chest, his breathing rough, but his pace unbroken. He leaned close again, speaking through gritted teeth, "Not today, you are not dying today." The beeping on the monitor flattened into a single tone. The air in a room seemed to grow heavier, pressing against every chest, as if the sound itself carried the weight of finality. The human's jaw clenched, and without slowing his compressions, he lifted one hand into a fist and slammed it down once against the patient's chest. The impact made a dull, deep sound that echoed in the silent hall. Then he returned to the steady pressing motion. The alien students stared wide-eyed, one whispering that this would surely shatter ribs, another saying that perhaps that was the point, to shock the heart into starting again. The human did not answer them, his eyes locked on the monitor, and the patient's face, his every muscle straining with effort, his voice dropping to a growl, "Come on, come back." The monitor let out a weak double beep, then another. The chest rose slightly, then again a little stronger. The human eased the pressure just enough to check the pulse, and a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "There is a heartbeat," he said without looking up, his hands already moving to secure the patient's breathing and stabilize the stitches that had loosened during the compressions. The alien medics hurried to assist. Now, following his commands without hesitation, they handed him fresh bandages and began setting up fluid replacement units, while he tightened the wrappings across the abdomen and clamped another hidden bleed. The patient's breathing was shallow, but it was there, and the beeping of the monitor grew steadier. One of the alien students whispered that they had just seen something impossible. Another replied that maybe this was simply what Deathworlders did, impossible things, because they refused to accept the alternative. The human finished the final wrap and stepped back only far enough to allow the medics to move the patient to the side care unit, his breathing heavy, his shoulders tense, as if expecting the next fight to arrive any moment. The instructor stepped forward slowly, his gaze fixed on the human. There was no smile, no warmth, only a careful measuring of the person before him. "You have broken every rule of alien medicine," he said, his voice low, but carrying through the hall. His eyes shifted to the students. "You have seen methods we do not use. You have seen actions we would never teach. Yet you have also seen results." The human looked back at him without flinching, his voice calm, but firm. On my world, we learn medicine in war, in disaster, in places where there was no time for clean or careful. There was only life or death, and the will to choose life no matter how ugly the method. For a long moment the room was silent, the instructor's gaze never leaving the human. Then slowly he gave a short nod. Perhaps there is something our academy can learn from you. Before any reply could be given, the intercom crackled to life again, the voice urgent and sharp. Military command requests the Deathworlder immediately for an emergency in the outer district. No alien medic has survived there before. Cliffhanger. The human reached for his bag and without a word started toward the door as the alien students realized they might have just seen the beginning of something far more dangerous than they imagined. The outer district was chaos long before the human arrived. Smoke rose in thick black spirals from the shattered buildings, and the ground shook with the distant thump of explosions. Every few minutes, alien emergency crews darted between debris, pulling survivors from collapsed structures, but their movements were cautious, their eyes scanning the shadows, as if expecting an attack. At any moment, the human stepped off the transport before it had even fully landed, his bag slung over one shoulder and his gaze already sweeping the wreckage. A local commander rushed forward, his uniform torn and dusty, his voice tight with urgency. The creature is still inside. He said, we cannot get close. It attacks anyone who enters. Even the rescue drones have been destroyed. We have wounded trapped under the rubble, and our medics cannot reach them. The human did not slow his pace as he answered, then I will get close. The commander blinked as if unsure whether he had heard correctly, but the human was already moving into the smoke, his boots crunching over shattered glass and twisted metal. The sound of distant screeches echoed from within the collapsed structure. Ahead, alien soldiers, standing guard there, shifted nervously as he approached, their weapons trained on the darkness beyond. One of them called out, warning that the thing inside had killed 3 armed units. In minutes, the human simply adjusted the strap of his bag and stepped past them without looking back. Inside, the air was thicker, the smoke mixing with dust, and the acrid stench of scorched material. The ground was uneven, littered with broken beams and fragments of wall. The faint sound of labored breathing reached his ears, and he moved toward it, stepping over a chunk of fallen ceiling and ducking under a bent support beam. The sound of claws scraping against metal came from deeper within, followed by a low growl, the kind that carried promise of violence. Through the dim haze, he saw a towering alien predator with long segmented limbs ending in hooked claws, its body armored in jagged chitin streaked with ash and dark fluid. One of its eyes was clouded with damage, but the other locked on him with sharp predatory focus. The human froze only long enough to measure the distance, then shifted his weight slightly and kept walking toward the noise of the trapped survivors, ignoring the predator entirely. The creature tilted its head as if confused, then let out a piercing shriek and lunged, its claws slamming into the ground where the human had stood a moment before, but he had already moved sideways, letting the momentum carry it past him. His left hand snapped to the side, pulling a small flare from his pocket. He struck it against the wall, and the sudden burst of white light made the predator recoil, its damaged eye narrowing against the glare. The human used the moment to slip past it, weaving through the wreckage toward a half-collapsed corner where he could hear faint voices calling out. He knelt beside a section of debris and shouted through the gap, hold on, I will get you out. The reply was a weak string of words in an alien language he barely understood, but the fear and pain in the tone were clear. He braced his shoulders against the rubble and pushed the metal creaking as it shifted inch by inch. Behind him, the predator hissed, its claws scraping against the floor as it recovered and stalked forward. The human glanced back once, then pulled a small canister from his bag, twisting the cap to release a dense cloud of smoke that filled the narrow space, masking his position. He shoved at the last piece of debris until it fell away, revealing 3 alien civilians, 2 injured badly and 1 unhurt, but shaking the human motion for the unhurt, one to help lift the wounded. They moved quickly, the predator's shadow looming larger in the smoke. The human pulled a collapsible baton from his bag, flicking it open with a snap and positioning himself between the civilians and the threat. As the creature lunged again, he struck hard across one of its limbs, the impact making a sharp crack as the chitin split greenish fluid spraying out. The predator screamed, rearing back and thrashing its other limbs wildly but the human pressed forward, jabbing at joints and weak spots, forcing it back step by step. The civilians stumbled past him into the corridor leading to the exit, their voices rising in panic. As the predator roared again, the human planted his feet and waited, letting it come at him, claws slashing through the smoke. He dodged once, twice, then swung low, smashing the baton against the side of its knee joint. The alien beast collapsed with a shriek, but lashed out with another limb, catching the human across the side and throwing him against the wall. The breath blasted from his lungs. He rolled to one knee, shaking off the impact, and grabbed a heavy shard of metal from the floor. As the predator advanced, he hurled it with all his strength, the jagged piece spinning through the air and striking the creature's good eye. The beast roared in pain, thrashing blindly, its claws tearing at the walls. The human did not wait for it to recover. He ran toward the civilians, catching up just as they reached the outer barricade. Medics rushed forward to take the injured, but the human caught the commander by the arm, his voice urgent. "There are more inside. I heard them calling from the far section." The commander shook his head, saying it was suicide to go back, and structure was unstable, and the creature was still alive. The human did not answer. Instead, he grabbed a fresh flare from his bag and turned back toward the wreckage. The smoke had thickened outside, making the broken silhouette of the building look like the open jaws of some vast predator. The alien soldiers shouted after him, but he kept moving, slipping inside again, where the air was hotter and the walls groaned under the strain of damage supports. The sound of shifting rubble echoed from above, and fine dust rained down on his shoulders. He could hear faint voices again, this time closer to the center of the ruin. He moved toward them, weaving through jagged gaps and ducking under hanging beams, his boots crunching over shattered stone. The sound of claws came again from behind him, slower this time, as if the predator was stalking him with more caution. The human kept going until he reached a collapsed stairwell, where two alien workers were pinned under a fallen slab. One was unconscious, the other awake, but barely able to move. He set down his bag and pulled out a small hydraulic jack, sliding it under the slab and pumping it quickly. The metal groaned as it began to lift, just enough for him to drag the conscious one free. Then he went back for the second. As he pulled the limp body out, a low growl rose behind him. He turned slowly to see the predator standing in the doorway, its blind face tilted toward the sound of his breathing, claws flexing. The human glanced at the civilians, then back at the creature, his mind already measuring distance and timing. He reached into his bag, pulling out the last flare and striking it against the wall. The predator hissed, but did not retreat this time. Instead, it began to advance slowly, testing each step. As if aware of the trap he was setting, the human shifted the flare to his left hand and the baton to his right, lowering his stance as the floor beneath them gave a long, ominous creak. A beam overhead split with a loud crack, sending a shower of dust and sparks down between them. The civilian screamed, urging him to run. The predator crouched, ready to spring, and the human could see the beam above it starting to bend, the weight pressing harder. Each second the structure was second from collapse, but the only way out was through the creature. He tightened his grip on the baton, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the strike. The roar of the predator filled the space as it lunged, and the ceiling gave way in a deafening cascade of stone and steel. Cliffhanger, the world vanished in dust, and the sound of tearing metal as both hunter and hunted were swallowed by the collapse. The dust was choking a dense cloud that burned the lungs and made the world vanish in a gray haze. The human's ears rang from the crash, and his head pounded, but he forced his eyes open, blinking through grit. Shapes began to form in the gloom, jagged metal beams twisted like broken ribs, chunks of shattered wall balanced at impossible angles. The air was thick with the heat of trapped fires smoldering somewhere nearby. His hand moved, first reaching for the nearest solid object, the baton still warm in his grip. He pushed himself up, slowly feeling the ache spread through his ribs, but he ignored it, scanning for movement. The predator was nowhere in sight, only the faint drip of liquid somewhere close and the creak of shifting debris. The civilians were gone, pulled away by the falling rubble, or perhaps they had found another way out. He hoped they had. A faint scrape sounded from his left, claws dragging over stone. He turned sharply, raising the baton, and listening. The sound came again, closer, this time slow, deliberate steps echoing through the ruined shell. The predator was still alive. The thought sending a rush of adrenaline through him. He moved away from the noise, keeping low and silent, weaving between slabs of concrete and splintered supports. The floor beneath him shifted once, sending a tremor up his legs, a warning that the entire section could drop at any moment. He slowed his breathing and focused his mind on the way forward. Then a muffled sound reached him, not the hiss of the predator, but a voice weak and strained, calling out for help in the alien tongue. It came from somewhere deeper in the ruins. He had no light except for a faint glow from his last flare still clenched in his left hand, its light casting flickering shadows over the wreckage. He followed the voice, picking his path carefully, his boots crunching over shattered glass. And as the sound grew clearer, until he found a narrow gap between two collapsed walls, a thin beam of daylight filtering through at the far end. Sliding through the gap, he entered a small pocket space where 3 aliens huddled together, one with a broken leg, the other two trying to shield them from falling debris. Their eyes widened as they saw him, relief mixing with disbelief. He knelt beside them, checking injuries quickly, then glanced toward the daylight beyond the gap. The ground shook again, and the faint daylight blinked out as something large moved across the opening, a low growl filling the air. The predator had found them. It stood half in shadow, its blind eye white and scarred, its remaining good eye locked on the human, its jagged limbs scraping the walls as it crouched lower, preparing to strike. The civilians tensed, but the human only shifted his stance, placing himself between them and the creature. The predator lunged forward, but the narrow space slowed its movement, giving the human just enough time to swing the baton hard against its leading limb. The crack of splitting chitin echoed through the chamber, greenish fluid splattering the wall. The predator roared and pulled back, thrashing in the confined space. The human shouted for the civilians to move deeper into the gap, away from the opening. Then he turned back to face the beast. With a burst of strength, the predator smashed through the wall, sending fragments flying, its head snapping forward, its jaws closing inches from his face. The human slammed the flare against its snout, the bright heat making it recoil in rage. He seized the moment to strike again, this time targeting the joint at the base of one leg. The blow landed solid, the limb buckling under the impact. The predator staggered back into the larger chamber beyond. The human followed, pressing the advantage, weaving around the debris and striking at weak points. The predator's movements were slower now, but its rage gave it bursts of terrifying speed. A claw sliced past his shoulder, close enough to tear fabric. He ducked low and rolled behind a slab of concrete, using it as cover for a moment to catch his breath. The civilians' frightened voices echoed from the gap, urging him to come back. But he knew if he ran now, the creature would follow, and they would not survive. The predator circled, searching for an opening, its claws scraping sparks from the broken floor. Its good eye fixed on the shadow where he hid. The human tightened his grip on the baton and waited for the moment. The creature lunged again. He stepped out, swinging upward the strike, connecting with the underside of its jaw, the force snapping its head back and sending it crashing into a pile of loose debris. The rubble collapsed over it in a heavy cascade, the impact shaking the floor. For a moment, there was only the sound of settling dust. The human breathed deeply, ready to go back for the civilians, when the rubble shifted and the predator burst out, even more enraged. One of its limbs hung limp, but the others slashed wildly, tearing through walls and floor alike. The human realized the unstable structure was close to giving way entirely. The sound of groaning metal filled the air, beams above them bending under the weight. He backed toward the civilians, waving for them to move quickly through the gap to safety. They obeyed, crawling and dragging the injured one through the narrow space. The predator saw them and roared, charging forward, its claws tearing into the ground. The human stepped sideways, planting himself in its path and driving the baton into the side of its neck. The blow staggered it, but did not stop it. Instead, it swung at him with its good limb, catching him across the chest and hurling him backward into a broken pillar. Pain flared white in his vision, but he forced himself to roll to his feet. The predator was already turning toward the gap where the civilians had gone. The human knew he had one chance left. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small cylindrical device, a compact demolition charge, the kind meant for controlled collapses. He twisted the cap and a faint hum began inside the predator's head, snapped toward him, sensing the danger. He held the charge in one hand and the baton in the other, stepping forward slowly until he was only a few feet away. The predator crouched low, ready to spring, its growl vibrating through the wreckage. The human feinted left, then threw the charge directly into the open wound at the base of its neck. The creature screamed, thrashing violently as the device wedged deep within its armored flesh. The human turned and ran, diving through the gap after the civilians. The roar behind him rose to a deafening pitch, then was swallowed by an explosion that ripped through the ruins, the shockwave flinging him forward into the dirt outside. The building, a rain of debris followed, metal and stone crashing down in a chaotic storm. He rolled to his side, shielding his head until the last fragments fell. The world was filled with dust again, thick enough to hide everything. Silence followed, broken only by the distant crackle of fire. He pushed himself up slowly, looking back at the smoking ruins. There was no sign of movement, no screech of the predator, just a faint hiss of cooling stone. The civilians stared at him, wide-eyed, their voices low. With awe, he managed a brief nod, then staggered to his feet. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath them shifted again, a deep rumble rising from below. One of the civilians shouted in panic, pointing toward the ruins, and that was when he saw a jagged claw tearing upward through the rubble, followed by the massive armored head of the predator, its body burned and torn, but still alive, its single good eye burning with fury. The creature hauled itself free, rising higher with each movement as the ground shook beneath its weight. The human's hand went to his bag, only to find it empty. No flares and no charges, no smoke grenades, just his battered baton. The predator roared and began to advance, each step cracking the earth between them. The civilians backed away, screaming as the humans stood his ground, the air around them filled with heat and dust, the sound of the predator's claws dragging closer and closer until it was only a few paces away, its shadow falling over him as it raised its limb for the killing strike. And then from somewhere beyond the smoke came another sound, low at first, but growing louder, the rhythmic thump of heavy engines and the hiss of hydraulics. The predator froze its head, turning toward the noise as shapes began to emerge through the haze, massive and metallic, with glowing lights and weapons raised. The human's eyes widened as the ground trembled again, this time not from the predator, but from the arrival of something else, something bigger. The haze split as the shapes came closer, towering forms of metal, each step sinking deep into the cracked ground, hydraulic limbs hissing with pressure, armored plates reflecting the glow of distant fires. The machines moved with purpose, their frames scarred from battles past, weapons mounted along their arms and shoulders, their eyes a hard blue light that cut through the dust. The human recognized the design, old warframes from a forgotten campaign, thought to be decommissioned decades ago, yet here they were alive and moving. The predator hesitated, claws flexing as it studied these new arrivals. The ground shook under the weight of the machines as they formed a semicircle between the human and the beast. The largest of them stepped forward, its voice a deep mechanical growl, ordering the human to stand down and move. Behind them, the human obeyed, stepping back toward the civilians, his eyes never leaving the predator, which now crouched low, its single good eye flicking from one warframe to another as if searching for weakness. The lead machine raised one arm, and a line of light burst from the weapon, mounted there, searing through the air and striking the predator's armored shoulder. The impact sent shards of chitin flying. The creature screamed a sound so sharp it seemed to pierce the very air, and then it charged straight at the largest machine, claws raised to tear through steel. The ground split under its weight, each step pounding like a drumbeat. The machine braced its legs, hydraulic locks engaging, and caught the first strike with an armored forearm. The force rattled the ground, but the frame held firm. The battle was brutal and fast, the predator striking with feral speed, and the machines countering with precision. Every blow from the creature sent sparks and fragments spinning into the air. Every shot from the machines tore another piece of its armor away. Yet the beast refused to slow, its roars shaking the dust from the ruins. The human watched with his heart pounding as one smaller machine darted behind the creature, firing concentrated bursts into the gaps the human had opened earlier with his baton. The predator twisted in rage, smashing the smaller machine with its tail, the impact sending it skidding across the ground into a wall with a shriek of torn metal. The largest machine pressed forward, driving the creature back step by step until the predator's claws found purchase on the frame's chest, carving deep grooves. The machine staggered under the force, but held its ground, pushing the creature back again. The civilians huddled close to the human, their fear mixing with awe as the air filled with the roar of engines and the shriek of alien rage. The predator suddenly shifted its weight, feinting toward the largest frame before spinning with terrifying speed and leaping toward the civilians, its jaws open wide. The human reacted without thought, sprinting forward and swinging the baton in a desperate arc, striking the predator's snout mid-leap. The blow staggered it enough for one of the war frames to intercept, smashing its fist into the creature's side and hurling it back into the dust. The human rolled to his feet, clutching the baton tighter as the machines moved to shield the group once more. The predator's body was now slick with green blood, its movements slower but no less deadly. It circled the machines, ignoring the human for now, its eye burning with a single goal to break through and kill the prey behind them. The lead frame gave a short burst of static over its speakers, and the others moved in unison, tightening their circle until the predator was trapped in a cage of steel and fire. Every weapon fired at once, the blast sliding the ruins in a blinding storm of energy. The smell of scorched alien flesh filled the air. When the smoke cleared, the predator still stood swaying on its legs, but alive. It let out a final roar and hurled itself at the largest machine. Both went crashing to the ground in a tangled mass of claws and steel tearing at each other with raw fury. The ground trembled with the struggle. One massive claw slammed into the machine's neck, cables snapping as sparks rained down. The human saw the predator's head rear back, jaws opening to tear into the exposed gap. Without thinking, he ran forward again, this time climbing onto the predator's back, his arms locking around its neck as he drove the baton into the wound where his demolition charge had torn the armor away. The predator roared, thrashing wildly, trying to shake him off, but he held tight, driving the baton deeper until it struck something soft inside. The creature's movements faltered, and in that moment the lead machine shoved upward, hurling the predator off its chest and slamming it to the ground. The other machines opened fire again, focusing on the same wound. The human had just struck. The predator screamed one last time and collapsed, its body twitching before going still, green blood pooling around it. The dust began to settle, the air filled with the low hum of the machine's cooling systems. The human stepped back, breathing hard, his clothes torn and covered in alien blood. The civilians stared at him as if seeing something impossible. The largest machine turned toward him, its blue eyes dimming slightly as it scanned him for injuries. A voice crackled through its speakers, asking for his identification code. The human hesitated, then gave his name and unit. The machine paused before responding with words he never expected to hear. Your unit was marked as lost in action 30 years ago. How are you still alive? The human blinked, the question striking something deep within him, memories flashing of the day his unit had been surrounded on another world, the day the command had ordered a retreat, but communications had failed, and they were left behind. How could 30 years have passed? His mind reeled as he looked at the machines, these relics of a war he barely remembered, and wondered what had happened to the galaxy since then. Before he could answer, the ground rumbled again, not from the predator, but from somewhere far deeper, a low bass hum that seemed to vibrate through the bones. The machines turned their heads toward the ruins, their sensors flickering with strange readings. The lead machine's voice was tense, ordering immediate evacuation, but the human stepped forward, his instincts screaming that whatever was coming was worse than the predator. The civilians began to back away, but the hum grew louder, the ruins shaking as cracks split the ground. A blinding light burst from below the collapsed building, as if the very earth was being torn apart. Chunks of debris were hurled into the sky by an unseen force. The machines moved to shield the group, but their scanners went wild, unable to lock onto whatever was rising from the depths. Through the light, a shape began to emerge, massive and alien, nothing like the predator or the warframes, a structure, or perhaps a living thing, its surface shifting like liquid metal, its edges bending the light around them. The human felt the hair on his arms rise, a pressure building in the air. that made every breath feel heavy. The civilians dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, as the sound of the hum became a single deep note that seemed to echo inside their skulls. The largest machine stepped forward, aiming its weapons at the rising shape, but its systems flickered and dimmed, as if drained by the very presence of the thing. The human realized the warframes were powerless here. Whatever this was, it was beyond their weapons, beyond their understanding, and as the light grew blinding, he saw the shifting surface open like an eye, and for a moment he thought it was looking directly at Hai.